Another Daftloday video. So he concedes that his last video he didn't explain shit, and so he's made this little 6-minute video where he proposes to do his explaining of some problem with my theory. So his first nonsensical rubbish point is about a round wheel, and he's saying that it's going 0 miles an hour here and 60 miles an hour up here, and I guess it's going 30 miles an hour this way and 30 miles an hour that way, or some kind of rubbish. Frankly, I'm not recognizing that what we're talking about are material things that are a collection of material things. So again, I'm arguing about what's happening to the atoms and what's happening to the little bits inside of them. They're the things that actually move. So when this pen moves, what has to happen is some force has to propel all of the protons, all of the electrons, and make them move. A force has to do that. There has to be something inside here where every one of those little pieces has communication with each other through a mechanism of pressure, which is these force elements, these virtual photons by conventional physics' description, but I say they're real, and they communicate a pressure. And so it's like magnets. If I put a bunch of magnets in an arrangement, flip them all the same polarity so they're repulsive, and if I theoretically tied a string, tying them all together, the outside ones, and I pushed on one of the magnets, the force will be conveyed to all of the other magnets, and they will all be pushed. So an invisible force between them will make them move. And that's a fact. And that's what's happening inside of atoms. So when he talks about, oh, well, you hit it with a quanta and, a roll of tape or something. There's a zillion interactions that happen when you hit this with a force. Zillions of interactions before the tape moves. It moves through the process of a zillions and zillions of interactions between electrons and protons and the little bits connecting them together. And that's physics. So he doesn't want to do physics. He wants to do some, some, I don't know, big thing material crap. Again, gravity is a nuclear force. The atoms are actually what's the neutrons and the protons and the electrons are actually the thing being affected by the force. There's no such thing as the Earth. There's just the atoms and the electrons, protons, and neutrons that make up the Earth. And they're the thing affected by the gravity. So, with that context, let's proceed with this rubbish.
For a velocity v equals 30 miles an hour, this means more of the arrows are going this way and less of the arrows are going this way. Well, this on the face of it is nonsense.
Right. It's not on the face of it nonsense. So what happened was more force happened on this side than happened on this side. That is, more force hit over here than hit over here, and this thing absorbed more of the more. It's that simple. It absorbed force going this way, but it absorbed more force going this way. So it's just about what gets absorbed. And absorption, as I have explained it repeatedly, back to the DraftScience page, involves this process of moving the electron, moving it, by it absorbing, a direction, stuff in a direction, unbalancing the pressure. So it has more internal pressure in one direction than another direction. And that internal pressure will keep pushing it in a direction until it loses that pressure.
Because any arrows that are going this way leave the body.
Okay, so again, another assumption. So I've only pointed out the pressure millions of times now, right? It has been millions, I think. The whole thing is under pressure, intense pressure. So there's no leaving the body, okay? It goes into the field, and the field reflects. The field pressure is constantly going in and constantly pushing it back together. So there's no leave the body without there being a reflection. And I've been over it and over it and over it and over it and over it. I mean, it's the whole function. I mean, if you want to find something to critique, explain how this doesn't actually happen. Because this is what creates magnetism, the repulsive force. It's the fact that when the bodies are farther apart, this is the photon right in here. When you push the electrons into each other, you magnify the number of interactions. You increase the pressure. Oh, shit.
And since the outside is a random mess, what is to say it acquires the right number of arrows to replace those? And not even that's...
Well, like if there was equal pressure on both sides, you could argue the thing is going to stay still if it has equal pressure inside. If you change the pressure on the outside, then you'll change the pressure on the inside and you'll move the thing. Why is this innately impossible? It's not innately impossible. You just want to make it so.
A factor. If you want to consider it so simplistically, like...
simplistically like bending space. That's not a simplistic explanation. The space is bent. Obviously, the geometry tells the matter where to go. That's not a simplistic explanation. Fuck.
30 mile an hour is 350 arrows going that way and 50 arrows going this way. Yeah. What is the mechanism?
No, it isn't. So, what is that even pointing out? I don't even understand that. So, but let's say that was a proper ratio, which I don't think it is. Again, this density is always going to be a problem. The density of this is so enormous. For just one electron, there's so much force involved that, yes, it gets difficult to put it into something we understand. And it's happening incredibly fast. We're talking about how long it takes a photon to travel a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of distance.
By which it goes faster. And I said, oh, well, quite easy. It gets one more arrow going that way. Yeah? Well, where's the mechanism of this incorporation of this? So now you have three...
Yeah, the mechanism is absorption. The force has to be here first. The force has to go into this first. There has to be extra arrows over here. The extra arrows spend time in here. The longer they spend in here, the farther this thing travels. Duh.
Why is it that these arrows stay with the body? These arrows very definitely leave the body. And how do you guarantee if it's to maintain some kind?
Yes, it's an exchange. Again, it's by these simple rules. There's an exchange. That's how it happens. And as I pointed out, for the electrons, they can't absorb momentum that's permanent. That's why electrons have to keep getting pushed. They have to keep being pushed by force. That's why you have to have an anode and a cathode. You have to keep pushing them, because they won't just go on their own. They lose their momentum for that very reason, because the external field coming in this way neutralizes any imbalances. It tends to destroy imbalance. The density of the external field imposes its will on electrons and protons. That's why they can't have free momentum, perpetual momentum.
And structure, it's going to have...
That's why we can't make ray guns out of them to kill assholes.
50 arrows replaced in a consistent way. That's the ambiguity.
Again, so he's calling that ambiguity, these strict rules about how it actually happens, he's saying that's somehow ambiguous. The only part that's ambiguous is, again, the point I've tried to make over and over again, that electrons have a structure. I didn't say they're just free force. I've called it locked, bound. Something happens when you do compress them. But the idea is that the electron has force in 3 dimensions. It retains a memory in 3 dimensions. And the simple truth is if you shorten a line in this direction, you have to lengthen a line in this direction, or this direction. So this is like a length of string. And if you make this length shorter, you make these lengths longer. That kind of rule. And ultimately, if you make it into one long string, then you have a photon. And you have something, you have a bunch of force moving in the same direction. But, you know, again, he provides no explanation for how bent space works, no explanation for how the electric field works, no explanation for how the magnetic field works, no explanation for a single fundamental property of a single event that takes place in the universe. In the sense, no explanation for how magnetism happens, no explanation for the nuclear forces, no explanation in any real sense of how gravity works, and yet he wishes me to dissect the innards of an electron. The rule is, okay, just simple, that if there's extra force out here, if there's force plus here and just force here, then this electron, this line will tend to get longer. That's the rule. These arrows get shorter and shorter, and these get shorter and shorter. Anything that's not going this way gets shorter because this line gets longer. That's the rule. Now, I don't think that's an extraordinarily hard thing to cognize or understand, that there's a mechanism inside the electron that makes that possible. Shit.
That's not even wrong, because it's just so non-principled.
Okay, so again, where's the principle for your magnetism? Where's your principle for your bent space? Where's your principle for the fucking electric field? Where's your principle for the magnetic field? Where's your principle for the movement of an electron? Where's your principle for a single mechanical thing that happens in the physical fucking universe by your fucking idiotic theory? You have no principled explanation for a fucking thing, and yet you sit there and arrogantly and piously say to everybody else, give me every single detail of how every single thing happens. I don't want to hear about a rule. I want to know exactly how it happens. I've explained to you how momentum is carried in material objects that contain atoms. I've explained that the very process of having this right turn makes it possible for there to be, say, four protons, and that those 4 protons could, in fact, trap force in perpetual turns. And that those turns could go in other directions. They could go this way, but that they'll always kind of be possible, that they always end up being the same circle. Even if it's not a round circle, it will be circular. Alright, and that if the mass of the electrons is on these paths, then that mass will move in the direction of this movement. And if there's no mass in this direction, say no protons or no electrons between these 2 protons, the force will travel freely and move no mass. And that creates the huge imbalance in the circle and creates the idea that it will process in the direction of the velocity perpetually. Clearly, this movement would not be conducive to going close to the speed of light. You wouldn't be able to maintain this structure going anywhere near the speed of light. And that's why I say matter will not survive the trip. Fuck.
That there's no clear defined principle that makes a consistent rigid body or allows for, if it's not consistent, i.e. all the members of the party get to be in the next room ahead of time, yeah, what's the mechanism by which it was structured anyway? All this.
Yeah, none of that is, there's no, you could do it frame by frame, and there's absolutely nothing that's doing anything magical in the sense that you could do it frame by frame and realize that this will be the outcome. Force plus here will mean the plus will be in here, and how long that plus stays in here will decide how fast this thing goes. Period. Period. Period, 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 period. And also the point has been made that this plus, because of this external pressure that's constant, that anything that gets in here likely can't get out of here because of the fact that it will reflect equally from both of these pressurized surfaces. So once there's a plus, let's say the plus is consumed, it goes in, that means there's just regular force here and regular force here. Now this plus is just going to bounce back and forth in that pressure, theoretically. So there's no violations or problems here. Again, it doesn't require a huge leap of any kind of faith to understand that matter is three-dimensional, a little more complex than one-dimensional matter, but that there is no obligation that electrons be perfect spheres or anything like that, that they can actually have disproportional length versus width circumstances, that they can get out of shape, and that would be perfectly acceptable and reasonable. But that the field energy, once it is balanced, once the plus stops irritating it, it will regain equilibrium by the rules of probability. If an electron, I'll explain this, but I'll explain it. Once an electron is imbalanced, so once you take this thing with 3 dimensions and say this line is now longer, and so it's moving this way. The point is the field energy is going to keep hitting it from the sides, the red energy, for example. And by doing that, it's going to hit this longer line more than it hits this shorter line. So it's more likely to knock one of these arrows free and convert it back into one of those arrows going some other direction. And in doing that conversion, it will knock this back down to its regular size. So just by the laws of averages, if this part is sticking out more, it has more mass in this direction than it has in that direction going down. This bigger thing, this longer thing, will be hit more than the shorter thing. Shit.
Has not been accounted for. So
again, everything I just said, I have said in previous videos. It has been accounted for. It's just a lie, more lying by the liar.
You can't say exactly where it's wrong because you're not even in a place where that kind of criticism can begin.
Right, so I haven't made it clear enough. I haven't made it simple enough for him to critique it. I haven't made the fundamental mechanism simple enough. This fundamental mechanism isn't simple enough. If it's a black arrow and it's a proton, it takes a right turn. If it's a red arrow, it reflects and exchanges a component in this direction. That's too complicated. It exchanges something going this way for something going that way inside the proton. That's too complex for him to, and too ambiguous for him to dissect and point out how it can't work.
Didn't happen, yeah. And you've made what, thousands of DraftScience video, all of this type of nature, yeah.
So he still thinks there's something wrong with pointing to something and illustrating it with your finger. So if I used a laser pointer, that would be okay, but using my finger somehow isn't appropriate. It's non-scientific.
When you have clear articles with headlines saying, this type of property, this property yields to the principle X, say, creation of a body, yeah, sustained of a body, the principle.
Well, where do you do any of that? So where in your physics do you have any of that? Where do they do that for the electric field, the magnetic field, the virtual photons they say that are conveying the force? Where do they explain how the atoms inside of a magnet move? How do they explain how they move? Where?
of sustained velocity, principle of accelerated velocity.
There's no such thing as a principle that applies both to the force and to the matter, as I'm pointing out. The only bits that have perpetual energy and that you could say is there's a law or a rule are the force bits that are moving the speed of light. Everything else gains velocity by capturing force. Force defines its velocity, and it has to hold the force to be able to have perpetual velocity. It can't have perpetual velocity, like a wrench thrown in space, unless it holds the force put into it. It has to have a mechanism to hold it in a trap. It has to trap the force so it can continually move more matter in one direction than it moves in the other. More mass.
Principle of absorption, principle of excretion, principle of maintaining equilibrium,
right.
All with several drawings neatly. Stage 1, this has happened. Stage 2, this has happened. Stage 3, this has happened.
There's absolutely none of that for any of this subatomic function. And nothing in my theory can't explain all of those thermodynamics. So any of those chemical reactions, any of those properties, my theory could perfectly satisfy those conditions. So again, another straw man argument that somehow I can't explain how a wheel rotates, or I can't explain how a carbon atom oxidizes, or I can't, I can. There's nothing that prevents me from explaining any of those kinetic interactions. Nothing. And there's no paper they publish explaining how the electrons and protons inside of a magnet move towards the other magnet.
A time comic book evolution, to these kind of lay principles, may substitute for some mathematics at some time, right? Because from these clear principles, there'll be a clear mathematical implication.
And again, I'm saying there's a clear mathematical implication in the sense that electrons will be subject to the laws of probability. In terms of if you lengthen one of these lines, there's a probabilistic outcome of it getting diminished. As I pointed out also, depending on how long that line is, how disproportionate the electron's condition is, that is, how much velocity it has, there's a mathematical formula that will probably be consistent with some math you might even understand, that if some new force impacts it in some direction, that this will change its acceleration or its velocity and change the vector of it based on how much of an influence is made. And as I pointed out, when this exchange is made, if something is, if a force comes in this way and it releases a force going this way, obviously the electron isn't going to necessarily go this way. It might end up going this way, because now there's an imbalance this way also. It has more energy. This line is longer than this line. So these two things are now pulling it in a different direction. So I guess I should have put the arrow this way, but anyway, you get the idea. So the motion of combining those two disproportions will be something in some other vector depending on how different these lengths are. That'll be mathematics, no doubt about it. That'll be a formulizable circumstance. Again, he keeps thinking math is the truth and that this geometry isn't the truth. This is the truth. The math isn't the truth. The physical properties that you're formalizing with the math, but the math is synthetic. The properties are real.
And if you can't derive it, then others can and say, look, these pictures don't add up. What it means is, predictively, at V1, you're at position X, and at V2, you're...
So now he's bringing up this canard again. of V1 and V2. Why don't you just leave that shit alone? If your velocity changes, it means a force had to influence you. There's no other way your velocity changed. So, what are you talking about?
Position, God knows fucking X, yeah? And then you can get legitimate criticism. Up until that stage, we're just going to criticise what we can, where it does appear you're temporarily stood still for long enough to be caught out, like when you say, my light clocks don't work, there are no multiple velocities.
Yeah, those are predictions that you can't bend light this silly ways you think you can give it to momentums. That's not going to work. So yeah, I'm saying your light clock will not survive your experiment. No clock will. Well, there might be a clock that will, but it's certainly not going to have anything to do with atomic forces.
There are no component velocities. It doesn't have multiple momentums. Blah 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 blah. When you don't understand, just showing that within the framework of these notions of that you are just flat wrong, showing you don't understand the framework within which these notions exist.
No, you don't understand the framework that the only thing moving in the universe are the electrons and the protons, dumbass, and the rest of everything else is a byproduct of that movement. So everything is this interaction, and there is nothing else. Dumbass. Ignorant fuck.
And so that's that, yeah?
Yeah, well, again, so this was his decisive proof that my theory doesn't meet the experimental evidence. So he provided absolutely no evidence of any experiment that disproves my theory, that makes it impossible for my theory to be a viable, to create a viable explanation. So we have, again, no evidence of this decisive evidence that he claims to possess or he claims to have provided that, does a damn thing. Nothing. Just more fucking lies. Alright, so now we have why is light slower in glass. So again, I believe I saw this video. They might have made a new one from 60 Symbols. But the old one had two different physicists with slightly different explanations. And both of them involve the absorption, okay, of the photon by an electron, okay. So this is basically their explanation. Obviously, I don't believe electrons are hurling around atoms and all, nucleuses and all that kind of shit. They're in positions. And the point is their argument is the photon goes in, it hits an electron. This is what I'm predicting will be in this video. And the energy level of the photon is increased for a moment. So it goes up to this higher energy level. And then when it drops back down again, it re-releases the photon. So the simple process is the photon hits, the energy level I think would be inside, obviously the higher pressure. So I would argue that the electron moves to the higher pressure. It's rejected by the higher pressure. It can't be sustained there, okay? And it doesn't have there's no room for it, frankly. So the electron gets hit, the electron absorbs the photon's energy, moves to this higher pressure, and then is forced back out, and then releases the photon again when it pops back to its old energy level. So it's just about going from one energy level to another energy level and releasing the photon. So the photon pushes it in, it pops back out, the photon's released again at a slightly different angle, and those angles inside the matrix of the atoms inside of glass make it possible for you to transmit light accurately. The glass has a strict geometry, and the geometry is conservative in the fact that something goes in this way, it'll come out this way. That kind of thing. Alright, so let's play with this nonsense. I hope it'll play. Some of these videos don't load.
Now hold on, will ya? There's more.
He's doing his little antics. Your antics are not funny, by the way.
More failures of DraftScience.
Yeah, right.
Is this double particle model of a photon, yeah, but not accounting for why light is slower in glass. Not
accounting for it. Again, I did account for it. I've explained it quite explicitly. The fact is that every time a photon hits an electron and is absorbed for a period of time, the electron moves incredibly slowly by comparison to the movement of the photon. So it loses a tremendous amount of speed while it's in the electron changing its momentum. And then when it's released again, it's obviously moving the speed of light again. And then when it goes back into an electron, the electron moves very slowly through time because the photon is in there. The energy of the photon is still in the electron. But as I pointed out, it's in there in a way that creates a very long line it's traveling, a very long distance in terms of the wobble of the electron.
Counting for why light diffracts, depending on its refractive index, by a very definite angle.
And yes, I've explained that also, so that's, again, just another lie.
His explanation doesn't fit the idea of why one solid thing can be transparent and another thing.
Sure it does. As I just explained, the geometry of the transparent thing is conducive. It's so perfect. The angles are perfect 45 degrees or whatever, and so therefore it just ends up repeating the pattern. It maintains the phase, so to speak, the phase angle. Where if the geometry is some other geometry, then the photon gets lost in the matrix because there are no consistent angles. So it gets caught in it and ends up becoming heat.
Isn't transparent. Best as I can recall, Mendham has it that light is slower because of it's bouncing around off the other stuff. Okay.
And again, that's a simplified explanation just to quiet the idiots who think the light actually slows down. So yes, I'm just making a counter argument to idiots who think light actually, the photons actually move slower by pointing out, no, they're traveling a longer geometry, and I use a fiber optic cable as an example. Fiber optic cables, the light doesn't travel straight through the cable. It's reflecting off the interior of the cable. So the light doesn't travel the distance of the cable at the speed of light. It's much slower because it's traveling a much longer distance.
Now, I forget which professor this is Professor Merrifield, yeah, and also he'll explain why the simple, naive guesses at what light can be doing as it passes through a solid are wrong.
Again, there won't be any explanation, anything inconsistent with my theory beyond the fact that I don't believe in the standard model of an atom. So I don't concede the existence of these things called energy levels and all that crap. These are positions, and the tighter the position, the higher the pressure. The further away the position, the less the pressure. That's my argument. Obviously, there's higher pressure implies more energetic.
This is of relevance also here. He won't exactly use the Huygens principle, but the point is what he'll describe are two explanations, which are two models which are useful to understand why light might travel.
Right, okay. Again, two models. So if I provide two different models in any of my physics, you'll allow me to do that. Or 3 or 4 or 5. How many am I allowed to? How many different models or explanations do I give you for a function, and you say it's okay? I can have 7 or 8 or 10. I mean, is there some limit on how many models I can give? Just want to know, so the double standard doesn't happen. I mean, I'm just trying to avoid your double standard, of course. See, because I know I'm not allowed to have two different models. I'm quite sure you wouldn't allow me to do that.
So one is a classical explanation, and as he will put it, it's easier to picture, and it holds true that the model fits the results. But he gives a second picture, which is the quantum mechanical model, which is different to the classical picture. And it leaves our interviewer a little bit puzzled when he says, what's really going on then? You know, don't give me this two pictures.
So again, so it's okay though. He's perfectly comfortable with the fact that they don't know for sure. That's okay. They don't have to know for sure. They can just give you approximations, general themes, like, you know, you get it. You know, the electrons They have energy levels, and you jump from an energy level for a brief, tiny moment, and then the electron jumps back and it releases the photon again. I mean, yeah, that's conceptually acceptable, but I couldn't say that and he would accept it. I mean, he's such a fucking hypocrite. It's just an insane hypocrisy.
Shit, just tell me the truth about what's happening, right? And he has to have some philosophy of physics explained to him here. That, well, you know, in one sense, the quantum model...
I mean, like I said, I saw this video already 2, 3, 4 years ago when it was made. I mean, this probably is the same video because he's talking about two theories. They weren't presented by the same guy as I remember, but maybe they redid the video. But I saw this years ago.
...is more right, and therefore, when pushed, we go quantum. But in a very real sense, there are just two models here, and that's all physics likes to do, is make a model, understand its limitations.
Oh, okay. No, see, that's all you're such a fucking hypocrite. I'm not allowed to do that. So again, just an amazing hypocrisy. They're not sure. They'll just throw some different models on the table and say, look, we're just doing draft physics. I'm not allowed to do that. That's a critical flaw in a theory to you. You're done. You can't talk about physics anymore if I do that. I mean, your double standard is insane. Fucking insane.
Understand its accuracy here, and sometimes both models, for this circumstance, give exactly the same answer. The fact that quantum mechanics has broader implications is the thing that makes it more appealing and more generally true.
Well, so no, he's claiming it's more generally true because it fits into his QM bullshit notions of fake Heisenbergy uncertain photon travel. No evidence. It's not like the explanation fits the evidence any better. He just likes it better. That's all Daftloday is saying. I want to fuck that one. I don't want to fuck that one. It's completely personal, subjective mush. No evidence why the quantum mechanical theory is at all better.
Because the one principle applies more universally.
How so? How does the other principle not apply universally? How is it in conflict with some other theory? It's not, because it's obviously a different circumstance than a two-slit experiment, isn't it? Yeah, it is.
So I'm going to start with that end frustrating comment as he explains this.
I understand. You go through two scenarios. There's a classical one, jiggling and adding the waves, and this quantum one, which is a bit more mind-bending, but nevertheless the maths works. The maths works for both of them. I accept that. Which one is actually happening? So that's the problem with physics, right? Is that physics...
Oh, it's just an awful, awful recording. I mean, I made the speed right, and it's just all noisy speakers. So, this is, I don't know, I mean, I don't know if there's any point in playing it.
They don't have one reality.
It's terrible.
There's one reality, and you can have multiple models. And sometimes the models are exactly, or as far as we can tell, the models are exact.
Okay, so again, he's just rationalizing having different models, because we really don't know what happens, blah, 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 blah. Like I said, if I was to do that, I'm done. I can't have a theory anymore. I'm not allowed to vacillate like that.
Anyway, in other cases, each model kind of captures some aspect of reality. In this case, you can sort of explain the whole thing in terms of the quantum model. There are things you can't explain in the classical model. So in that sense, the quantum model is more right. But actually, the classical model is very helpful because it's much easier to picture. And actually, you don't end up with these mind-bending things of one photon following an infinite number of possible paths and those kinds of things.
Right. So, like I said, the quantum says the photon went to Pluto, and it went to Mars, and it bounced over there, and then it went back into the electron. Yeah. So the quantum model has this silly element of, because it's a probabilistic possibility, we'll consider it a practical possibility.
Well, that's arguable because this is a kind of a competition, and I'm not going to. The other guy, Professor Murrayfield, or Moriarty, talks about the sum over history's infinite possibilities in a more quantum analogy of the classical analogy, so to speak.
Oh, well, that's even better then. I mean, it's even more ludicrous. So I'm sure I could pick that apart. As I remember the video, okay, there wasn't, those weren't the two guys arguing, so this must be a different video. Because I don't remember any quantum mush being the winner.
Anyhow, let's just press on with this first, a little bit with the quantum, the classical model, I think. He's explained the problem with the naive views, which I'll leave Mendon to scrutinise and explain how his system isn't subject to these criticisms.
It's not subject to them because I'm not the one asshole. I'm not the asshole saying light actually travels slower in glass, in the sense the light actually doesn't travel slower. The photon goes into the glass, the photon probably stays in the glass, and a new photon leaves the glass. That's my theory, asshole.
To start thinking, with these microscopic systems, you can think about them classically, or you can think about them in terms of quantum mechanics. And somehow we're similar.
The point I wanted to make is that the Huygens principle, and I've said it time and time again, and Mr. Ignorant, fingers in his ears, won't hear it, Huygens principle is a classical model.
Well, again, he's what's the word classical mean in this context? It's certainly not a model that had anything to do with a Newtonian classical model. So again, you just keep changing the goalpost here. 1 minute Newton's classical, 1 minute Newton is what? What is he now then, if that's not the classical model?
And so when push comes to shove, it's not adhered to as a principle, because the quantum principles also explain the phenomenon.
Yeah, well, again, so why don't you do that then? Why don't you do the two-slit experiment, the single-slit experiment without Huygens with your whatever, your quantum mechanic model?
You know, but more broadly true, and explain further things, in other words. I'll let you go and explain the classical model of light.
I mean, he just keeps making up this thing that somehow physics has some backup explanation or something. They don't have a backup. They got Huygens or nothing. They don't have an explanation without Huygens.
It's just like, you know, sometimes like a ray, sometimes like a particle. So when you think about both possibilities, let's start with the classical end of things, the wave end of things. What you've actually got, in the solid, is a whole bunch of atoms arranged in one lattice. As the light comes in as an electromagnetic wave, okay, so basically a varying electric field, that's going to jiggle in the atoms in this thing because they've got charges and so on. So
okay, it's talking about jiggling all the atoms. So the photon goes in. Obviously, that's the whole point that I've been emphasizing, is that every single electron and every single proton in a material substance, okay, that's, you know, what we traditionally call as matter, is bound to each other, okay, by these tons moving back and forth. They're pressurized. They are repulsively and attractively pressurized. So if you move one here, you will move them all in a sense. They all will feel that effect throughout the entire mechanism. And it will keep moving. The force doesn't stop moving. It keeps on moving inside of here. The vibration never stops. There's no friction. Nothing gets eaten up. So once something goes in, it bounces around in there theoretically forever until it's expressed as actual movement of the objects. Their position changes, and then they now shutter in a new place. So they're shuttering in position A, you know, shuttering, and then the force goes in, they shutter in all kinds of new ways for a little bit, and then at the end they have a new position B, and then they go back to their old shutter. But that's the effect, the cause and the effect.
Electrons get pulled around by that electric field as well as past. And that's going to, when you then start moving those electric charges around, that means that each atom is going to respond by producing electromagnetic waves of its own. So when waves come in, you start jiggling the atoms around, which means each of the waves will then...
Right, so now he's just basically saying that, okay, first you jiggle the electrons, let's say, the electron, then you jiggle the atom, and then all the atoms of, especially something like glass, a rather rigid substance, all the atoms, the reason why it's rigid is because the atoms are stuck to each other rather firmly in these force connections. Their electrons are in just the right position to each other, where there is protons creating attractive force and then electrons creating repulsive force. And so they're bound tightly together, so they also convey. Any vibration of this atom will vibrate this atom. And again, that vibration doesn't wear off until the atoms move.
So oscillating in sympathy with the waves, wasn't it? And it's the superposition of the wave coming through the Higgs-boson wave and all these sort of waves that are being created by the atoms that make up the material. When you add all those waves together, you end up with the form of the wave that's actually propagating through the glass.
Right. So the point would be superposition against this force argument. And the real argument is that the forces don't interact with each other. Okay, so a force emitted and a force emitted by this object, the forces don't interact with each other. The forces only interact if there's something to mitigate. So if you put something in between these two things, then these forces can interact. Or they can interact with each other, of course. But expelled force out here and force out here can't do anything until they're bound by some other material thing that connects them. So there has to be material bits connecting things for force to be communicated.
And that wave is the one that's then travelling at less than the speed of light.
So again, he's just really, it's another way of just saying what I said, which is the force is spread out over the entire material object. It resonates and vibrates every single thing in the thing, the frequency of the light. So he's just going based on the frequency of the light creates a vibration at that frequency. That vibration moves through every single bit of the matter, and therefore that takes time. Duh. Obviously I wouldn't explain it that way. That doesn't sound incredibly complex quantum mechanics to me. That just sounds like a shortcut. It doesn't really get to the what's happening between electrons and protons.
It is, in a sense, similar to the Huygens, where, you know, but you get the... It's not...
There's no Huygens necessary. There's just the simple fact that the atoms are all electrically connected to each other, and if you move one, you have to move the other. The force will be felt. It'll feel the pressure. You can't move it without increasing pressure or decreasing pressure.
Exactly the Huygens principle, but following from the Huygens propagation in semicircles, the point is in electronics...
If that was happening, then it would lose the force. The light would dissipate. So it can't happen that way, because then it would escape. You know, it can't be Huygens radar, because then you have to explain how the radar recollapses. And again, you haven't even explained how the photon creates the radar, the Huygens radar.
Voltages, functions act like a vector space. They can be added and summed to an aggregate, and then they can be filtered out again. They can be put together into a complicated waveform, and then you can apply filters and filter out the fundamental frequencies again.
Oh, and where did you show us the mechanics for that? Oh, I don't think you ever detailed all those mechanics, huh? Amazing.
Right? This is a property that only exists in mathematical vector spaces, and I would say only in...
Okay, so again, he's making these declarations that, again, nobody else can explain it in any other way, and here in the video they're explaining it two ways. And you know, so what exactly do you want me to explain? You know, what thing do you think you can only explain with your secret power math or something? What is it? Because I'm sure I can explain it with a mechanical model.
Emergent systems, such as water, aggregates.
Emergent systems, another nonsense word to be using in physics, in my opinion. I mean, you know, there's cause and effect, you know, and we can describe the effects. So there's no point in calling them emergent.
Atoms jiggling about, sloshing around, yeah, where you can have the notion of adding and subtracting reality, yeah, and also in the idea of electricity, you get this emergent phenomenon where you've got the...
So again, he's calling it an emergent phenomenon when, obviously, in my opinion, electricity, there's no emergent phenomenon. There's physical events. The magnet segregates force. It hits the electrons with extra electron repulsive force. it moves the electrons with that force. And it does exactly the opposite to the protons, creating polarization in the conductor, which turns into voltage in the conductor.
Adding and subtracting of sloshing about of electrons, so to speak, being pushed around, almost fluid-like. Similar emergent properties of wave propagation in air, which is a fluid.
So again, this has something to do with daft answers versus QM. Like somehow there's something about what I'm saying that can't explain these phenomenon. You know, a crock of shit.
You know, treated as in fluid dynamics. I don't think I finished what I was going to say there, but...
Yeah, you haven't been relevant in any of these videos. You never get to this point where you demonstrate any catastrophic flaw in my physical model.
Right, so that's the classical wave analysis of the supposition of waves. This isn't meant in the quantum mechanical sense of a supposition of waves. What this is...
Yeah, so now that was just great sentencery, right? It's this, but it isn't that. It either is or isn't. And so let's not even use the word superposition, because obviously nobody's going to use it correctly anymore. You know, they're going to use it for spooky action or entanglement. That's not what it means.
Is basic vector space mathematics, which allows you to add and subtract functions and also multiply functions by a real number or...
So again, obsession with mathematics and ignoring the fact that the math is just a formalization of a relationship between some cause and an effect. That's all mathematics diagrams, is a relationship between a cause and an effect. That's it. There's no magic math. There's no physical phenomenon that is mathematical in its fundamental nature. It's doing something physical. That's why it's called physics. And it's not called mathist.
Whatever. Right? So I'll jump forward to his quantum mechanical explanation.